Hello, and welcome to Continuing Education, the podcast for homeschooling families with actually useful information. I'm Heidi, and today we're diving into a topic that's both essential and timely: how to raise critical thinkers during election season. Now, I know that this can be a sensitive subject, especially for us parents. It's really easy to slip into an us versus them mentality. But I believe that as homeschoolers, we really have a unique opportunity to learn from all people and all sides of an issue. We're not just educating our kids in academic subjects, we're building communities and we're exposing our kids to a wide range of perspectives. And most importantly, we want to raise critical thinkers who can develop their own informed opinions. One of my favorite things is engaging my kids in debates, providing them with facts, and then watching as they form their own thoughts and opinions. And of course, this means that sometimes they may disagree with me. That's okay, although sometimes frustrating. But I was raised in a house where politics was often the topic of conversation. In fact, I had an uncle who, no matter what your opinion was, he would challenge you. And he really forced me to think through my beliefs, to justify them, and to defend them. It was frustrating as a child, of course, but it taught me so much because he made me consider things from all angles. Sometimes he would even switch sides mid-argument, and it would force me to use reasoning and facts to back up my stance. He helped me realize that rarely is an issue just one thing. It's usually multifaceted, intersecting with other issues in unexpected ways. And so I've carried that approach into my own parenting. I like to challenge my kids in similar ways, and as a result, they don't always know where I stand on certain issues. Often when they ask me a question, they know that I'm going to respond with, "What do you think?" And this gives them an opportunity to practice those critical thinking skills. So for example, when the news comes on, they might ask who we voted for. We're not eager to tell them. I'm confident they've picked up on these things over the years, but we really do try to stay unbiased as much as we can. So what is critical thinking and what can you do to build it? The formal definition is the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. But let's be real, that's really tough because it requires us to set aside some of our beliefs that we've been conditioned to hold and help our kids come to conclusions after much thinking, pondering, challenging, and learning. The good thing is that critical thinking extends far beyond politics. It's essential in everyday life, whether in higher education, career choices, or social circles. And while critical thinking is about coming to a conclusion based on objective analysis and information, it doesn't end there. And I think that that's where a lot of people kind of get stuck. They get presented their information, they decide there's a topic they want to research, they go and get the information, they come to a conclusion, but then they don't do it again. When new information comes to light, we're obligated to go through that process again, to challenge our ideals, and to be willing to arrive at a new conclusion if the evidence points that way. And so teaching those critical thinking skills now and using them throughout your kids' childhood will teach them to go through that process a couple of times. And when you apply it and you're willing to change your mind when new evidence hits you, that's a good way to kind of demonstrate that. So during election season, I thought this would be a great topic to cover because critical thinking becomes particularly crucial. There is an overabundance of information and misinformation. The polarization and bias in media and political discourse makes it even more challenging. I started college as a communications major, and I took a lot of interest in journalism. And it's been shocking to see how much the media has transformed in just the 20 years that I was involved in school newspapers and media classes. Little things like the headline structure or wording choices that allow for bias seem much more acceptable now than they did then. Balancing personal beliefs with objective analysis is really key. Our religion, our personal experiences, they obviously are going to shape our opinions, and that's okay. But one key thing is being sure to being able to recognize what we're valuing is based on belief rather than purely that objective analysis. So let's dive into it. The first strategy that I use to teach my kids about critical thinking, teaching them how to critical think and applying those skills in daily life, is I myself have learned about logical fallacies, and then I'm working to teach them to my kids. So logical fallacies are errors in reasoning that undermine the logic of an argument. At first, they might sound strong, but if you just think about it for a little bit or you take it to its obvious conclusion, the argument really falls apart. They're everywhere. You've probably used them. I know that I've used them. We see them in social discourse all the time. We see them in debates and speeches. I'm going to go ahead and give you three of them that I think are commonly used, just so you get an idea of what I'm talking about if this is something you haven't heard before. The first one is an ad hominem attack. So this is where you attack the person rather than the argument. And if you're a homeschooling parent who maybe didn't do that great in high school like me, or you didn't go to college, or you didn't finish college, or you're not the most organized, whatever attack it is, I'm confident you've heard this. Why should we take your opinion on educational reform seriously? You didn't even finish college. That's the argument, right? Why should we take you seriously? You didn't finish college. That's an attack on the person as opposed to a discussion of the idea. And I've heard this all the time. Why should you be able to homeschool your kids? You didn't even go to college. Not me. I went to college, but I've seen that argument in homeschooling as a justification as to why homeschooling shouldn't be allowed, when that's not the discussion. The discussion is, should homeschooling be allowed, as opposed to attacking the person who homeschools. Another example is the no true Scotsman. So this is when you redefine a group to exclude certain people in order to strengthen your argument. So the argument for that one may be, if someone eats honey, they're not a true vegan. Well, you're redefining what it means to be a vegan to exclude people who have honey, right? As opposed to an actual definition or a definition that maybe we've agreed to, basically saying that you're not one of us because you don't think this certain way, or you don't fit this new narrower definition of how we're determining true vegans are. The third one, this again is one that I've commonly seen in debates. It's the slippery slope. That is the argument that if one change happens, that it will lead to this chain of negative events, such as if we implement background checks for gun purchases, the government will eventually ban all guns, leaving citizens defenseless. So it's kind of maybe we're talking about background checks, and we should keep our argument solely focused on background checks and not the 4 or 5 things that may happen or may not happen based on that one debate. Let's talk about the one issue and discuss reasons for or against that one issue, as opposed to all these other hypotheticals that may or may not occur. So that's the first thing, is learn about logical fallacies, be able to recognize them and point them out, help your kids understand them. The second thing is teaching media literacy skills. So one of my kids, when the Russia war against Ukraine began, he was really interested in it. He's really big into battles and wars. And so he was always wanting to know who's winning, where are they positioned, why did they choose that way? And that was a really good opportunity to talk about news in general. So we would pop on the news and we would kind of get an update of how things were going with the war. And there were things that we were able to quickly point out. So for example, we would like to flip through the different channels because it allowed us the opportunity to point out their wording choices, right? We would be able to say, oh, they're saying anti-Russia or pro-Russia versus anti-Ukraine or pro-Ukraine. How they phrase that and their wording choices in general really gives you the bias. Even just now, I use bias in my language. I said the Russia war against Ukraine. That clearly means that I believe Russia is the aggressor, and gives you my opinion about the war. That was a biased way to even phrase that. So being able to kind of compare wording choices across networks, across news sources, helps your kids develop those skills and seeing it for themselves. Another example that we were able to point out is, sometimes you pop on a news channel and there's a talking head. That's what we call him. Just a guy who has his own news show, and they call it a news show or a news segment, and it might even say breaking news at the bottom, but that is actually not news. That's an opinion. So those are not necessarily designed to be unbiased. So recognizing that can be subtly polarizing. Just because a guy is talking on a news channel doesn't mean that it's news. It could be an editorial show. We see that all the time where people be like, oh, I saw it on this show. Well, that's an opinion show. That's an editorial show. Recognizing news from editorial is one of the biggest barriers. One study that I read from University of Rochester actually found that media language now is more polarizing than ever. And while there's no true unbiased news source, because we all carry with us, backgrounds and preferences and history, quality journalism outlets, they really strive to minimize the bias. So at our house, we tend to turn to the Associated Press. We have found them to be the least biased. But even there, we can talk about the wording choices and how they're framing it in order to present an issue to us. If that's something that you're interested in pursuing, is trying to pursue non-biased sources, I'll link a media bias chart in the show notes so that you can get an understanding of where they kind of rank based on some studies that have been done. So the third thing that we do is I guess it's kind of related to the second one, is we like to use real life and examples and case studies. So for example, when we're talking about the Russia war against Ukraine, one, that allowed us to draw on history, right? Because we could talk about, well, let's talk about the history of this area. We could draw on his interest with battles and wars, and we could say, why would they cut off the port? But other things we do, like we watch CNN 10. It's a short daily program that keeps our kids engaged in current events. And this allows us to spark deeper conversations. So when they talk about something, going to the moon or whatever current events are happening, that allows us to have conversations about topics that we might not have thought to introduce our kids to. We may not have thought about there being a space race, or recently astronauts are kind of stuck. And so we may not have ever thought to talk about them. So then we can talk about our relationships with other countries and how when it comes to going to space, countries have an agreement that we get along, scientists get along, even if the countries don't get along. Those are conversations we can have and things that we can even research in the moment, because I don't know them all. That helps us have those conversations that gives us a greater context for things that we might not have even thought about presenting to our kids. The last thing is to encourage questioning and curiosity. So there are going to be lots of times, at least in our home, where their questions are going to challenge your values. And it's really important that you don't shut them down. You want to encourage dialogue and conversation so they feel safe exploring ideas. I try really hard not to speak negatively against others' perspectives, because my child might not hold the same thoughts that I do. And if I'm speaking negatively about somebody else's perspective, then in essence, I'm speaking negatively about their thoughts. So we encourage our kids to speak freely. We want them to point out holes in our argument, and we will even encourage them to do that. Even if it's, something that I hold near and dear, I want them to point out flaws in my own reasoning, because for us, it's a conversation and it can help both of us. But really, it allows them to learn the skills to kind of push back, right? It's not just because I said so and I'm your parent and these are my opinions and therefore you must have them, but allows them to develop the language and the skills to push back, to advocate for themselves and advocate for what they believe in as well. So here's an example of how a conversation went in our house. We recently, my son and I were driving, and we passed this huge sign. I mean, it was ginormous. It had to be like 12 feet long if it was an inch. 12 feet long, 4 feet tall. And it said name. It didn't say name. It said the name of this politician who was running. So-and-so voted yes to kids' gender trans surgery. Well, one, honestly, I was a little annoyed because this was not a conversation I wanted to have with my teenager. But nevertheless, here we are. This sparked a conversation about political ads and logical fallacies. So we talked about the sign. We talked about how we analyzed it for logical fallacies. Is it a hasty generalization? Is it a straw man attached? Is it trying to appeal to our emotion and make us scared? Is it talking about a slippery slope? And then we went and researched why did they say that? What were they voting yes to for someone to come to the conclusion that it was okay to have trans surgeries for kids? And we went and learned about the history of that sign. We can't just take that sign at face value. We can't just look at the sign and be scared. We need to go research why are they making that claim, and is it accurate? And that led to a whole conversation about how to analyze evidence and how to form conclusions based on political candidates. Okay, we went and researched and found information. Well, now we need to look for disconfirming evidence. Let's seek out research and views that might disagree with what we think. Well, how do we land on this? And based on that information, now who do we vote for, right? So critical thinking, it's an ongoing process. It's going to happen during election season, and it's kind of up to you to help your kids sort this out. The information is flying fast and furious, but it's a skill that will serve our kids well in all areas of life. So it's something that it's really important that we don't neglect and that we be intentional with how we're teaching it. I would really love to hear from you. How do you teach critical thinking in your homeschooling environment? I hope that you share your experiences and your strategies with us. Thanks for listening. And until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep raising those critical thinkers.